All right, now for the third and final part of this lecture, and I know it's already running quite long, so I hope to wrap it up soon. I want to talk a little bit about the social and cultural consequences of this process of industrial revolution before then getting to the crisis of 1857 and what that has to do with the Civil War. So first of all, like I said before, there are two countervailing things happening as a consequence of this industrial revolution. On the one hand, people are enthusiastic. Space and time have been conquered. The meaning of time changes. If it no longer takes you 3 weeks on horseback to get from A to B, but you can get there in 2 days by railroad. If you can suddenly in upstate New York get fresh oysters from the coast, oysters that go bad within a day if you don't refrigerate them, that is a huge advantage, and it really improves people's lives in a tangible fashion. But whatever people are uneasy with this new market and the power it has and the way it changes everything, also gets focused on the outposts of that market. The commercial frontier, these towns like Lockport that spring up, or Chicago is another great example, had 50,000 people living there in the 1850s, and it was 1 million people a little less than 2 decades later. It's just an explosive growth. People mix together from different backgrounds. You don't know your neighbor, and many of them don't speak your language. There is no immigration from Ireland in particular in construction work, and they are frequently the first targets of any nativist discontent. So the violence that you saw in Gangs of New York, that is pretty much an accurate depiction of that. One of the things when we're talking about the way that markets change, that the culture changes as a result of the Industrial Revolution, saying that the market used to be a place where you knew the people who made the stuff you bought, that is sort of the light side. It was a personal thing. It makes it look quaint and cozy. On the other hand, especially in the big cities, markets always had a seedy side. There were hucksters, there were gamblers, there were actors and mimes and jugglers, prostitutes, thieves. And this is another association with the market that has been around for a long time, and a reason why it wasn't considered proper for women of good breeding to be in a marketplace. Now, for working class women, that's a different story. You had to go to market either for your own family or because you were the servant in somebody else's house. But women of a good background, who might actually have some money to spend, couldn't go into a marketplace, couldn't handle money on their own. That would have diminished their womanhood. So one ingenious way of changing that in the 1850s is to make the marketplace safe for respectable women. The general stores that are set up in the countryside are one of the examples of this, where it is a proprietor who sets the tone. You're not just going to a place where everybody has a market stand. There's one person who's in charge. But even more so, the department stores. And the department stores are consciously set up. And this is Macy's flagship store in New York in the 1850s. They are set up to be showcases of the products and the spirit of this industrial modernity. Consider here the the ground floor, what you see is high glass windows. You see the figures, the people. Let them be maybe 6 foot tall. So you have a 12-foot high glass window front, all the way for the full length of this storefront. And that is an amazingly effective way of breaking up that space. You no longer have to step into a dark interior to get into the place where money and things change hands. But the things now present themselves in their best light out in the world. You still can get to them because they're behind glass, but it really opens the whole thing up. It also makes it possible for people to window shop, literally to walk and look at the things in the windows, and then maybe go in and buy something. But this becomes a thing in itself. To go shopping becomes a pastime. And that's an invention of the 1850s. It's something you can do for fun. People would not have dreamt of that before. Within these department stores, this is Macy's ladies' shoes department. These shoes are no longer made by artisans who are working to order. So if you remember the journeyman ladies cordwainers who made women's shoes in New York in the 1820s and went on strike, in one of the documents you read, you wanted to make a pair of shoes. If you wanted to get a pair of shoes, you had to walk into the workshop, you had to take your measurements, and then they would make it for you from scratch. Here, the artisan is not in the picture. The shoes are prefabricated, standardized sizes. The salespersons are working class women, specially trained for this task, to make it feel like a parlor, someplace where women of good society can feel at home and where they can participate in the process of becoming fashion conscious and knowledgeable in fashions. So the shop girls who do the sales and the advising of the customers are trained for that. They're the first modern sales people, I guess. So all of that is completely new, and it feminizes and it sanitizes the marketplace. It tries to free it, to scrub it of the seediness, and to make it so that people of good standing who have extra money can get into the marketplace and spend all that money on industrially manufactured things. Now, it is also evident to anybody at the time with access to a newspaper, and that means pretty much anyone, where the newspapers print the so-called prices current on a daily basis. Every newspaper has pages upon pages of prices for goods traded in that city recently. So you always know what things are worth. It's a matter of transparency. Somebody is trying to sell you something at an inflated price, you know, because you can check your prices current. But it also discloses the global nature of this marketplace. This is an excerpt from a newspaper in New Orleans. And what you see here, if you consider the right-hand side, now the left-hand side is all about the sale of cotton. That is, of course, the lifeblood. New Orleans is where the Mississippi ends, and the cotton is transshipped onto ocean-going vessels from the plantations. So that's the export market, but the import market on the right-hand side is the stuff that is imported in New Orleans. Consider here, for instance, the very first one, bagging per yard. Bagging, obviously stuff that you need in order to package the cotton, but it has to be imported from someplace else. From Kentucky, from East India, meaning Indonesia and places like that, and from Germany. So this simple item, the crude cloth sacks that are used to package things that are being shipped can be had from Kentucky, from India or Indonesia, and from Germany. All these places are obviously very different and far apart. They come together and become comparable on the pages of this newspaper. So it is like Thomas Friedman said, the world is flat. Hello, hi. Sorry, I was upstairs and didn't make it to the phone on time. Oh, oh, okay. Yes, of course. See you soon. Bye. The world is flat, and these places are directly next to each other. If not in the real world, then on the page of this newspaper. But what that also means is that for the purpose of a global market, a farmer in Indonesia and a farmer in Germany and a farmer in Kentucky are competing in the exact same marketplace. So they are comparing their product and their labor to each other, whether or not they know it. But in fact, they do, because they are, by virtue of participating in the marketplace at all, participating in a global marketplace. So this is a disconcerting thing for people. Especially since it seems to carry through to the individual character. A good, like a piece of cloth that is used for packaging, might in fact have a clearer pedigree. It might be clearer to say this is the nature of this item of cloth, and this is where it comes from, than a person. In these big cities that are springing up and that are growing, that are mushrooming, many people want to get into business. They can present themselves as trustworthy. They can say, you know, I have a background in this line of business. I have a degree. I know people who are important, but you can't really tell for sure. So a lot of literature in this age deals with what to buy, how to dress, like how to play the game of consumer culture and fashion to present yourself as somebody people would trust, in order to, if you want to, in order to deceive them and to take advantage of them. And there's a whole nother body of literature that is about how to decode what other people do in terms of dressing and presenting themselves in certain ways. So even interpersonal interaction becomes something that is in need of commodification. You are offering your character and you're hoping people buy it. You're hoping people buy the way you present yourself. And just like the price is current and advice manuals and so forth for commodity traders, so the self-help literature makes people, or hopes to make people, more savvy consumers of other people and their personalities and their self-presentation. So that is, again, something that, especially in more traditionalist settings, becomes an argument against the marketplace. So when somebody like George Fitzhugh says, in the South, in the country, where everybody works in the land, on the land, people are honest, you know who you're dealing with, that is essentially the selling point here. And in comparison, of course, now moving on to discussing the relation this has with the Civil War between the North and the South is hardly affected by this because, let's face it, the biggest group in that society is the plantation slaves, and they are not allowed to work for themselves. They do not have money. They don't become consumers in a marketplace in their own right. So from the northern point of view, in the South, the South starts to look even more out of place in the United States the more northern society changes in this way. And then what happens is that in 1857, the North is shaken by the first really big worldwide crisis of financial markets. We had the previous ones in 1819 and in 1837 that were bad enough. This is worse, and it is more widespread. Where companies that were considered solid and well-established go belly up within a week, where suddenly merchants sit on heaps of unsold and unsellable goods because they can't finance the transportation, or they don't find anybody with money to spare to buy this stuff. People lose their jobs, banks, merchant companies go under. Of course, the industrial facilities that have been built and the railroad companies, many of them also are shuttered. In the end, however, those who do still have capital end up coming out the winners. They buy up what is now available for cheap, they consolidate. And so as a result, once the crisis is over, and that it really isn't fully over until the Civil War starts, you get a concentration of industry. So where you had 4 competing factories before, in the end you get 1, and the person who owns that is wealthier than the 4 of the initial owners were combined. So the market power of the surviving industrialists is increased. But for many people, this crisis becomes a point where they really begin to question, is this industrial capitalism sustainable? Is it working? And if you look at the timeline here of crises over the course of the past 200 years, you see that this becomes part of the picture, and it becomes increasingly clear that the crisis is an inherent feature of an industrial capitalist world market. The reason why you don't get one for 60 years between 1929 and 1987 is because during that time, financial markets were regulated. You had the Glass-Steagall Act that put brakes on many of the things banks would have liked to do. And then so by the early 1980s, bankers started going to Washington saying, look, we haven't had a financial crisis. Why do we need these laws that protect us from financial crisis? It's like saying, well, the house hasn't burned down. Why do we need sprinklers? Why do we even need to have a fire alarm? So the deregulation happened in the 1980s. And of course, predictably in 1987, you had another crisis, small, nothing really that catastrophic. Different because they already were using computers, so it was faster. But the real one came in 2008, and at that point you see we're pretty much back on a 20-year recurring cycle of economic crisis. And since the attempted re-regulation of financial markets since then was more or less nipped in the bud by lobbying efforts, you can probably safely assume that by 2028 there will be another one, a big one. So I am not a licensed stockbroker, and you can't quote me on this advice, but by 2025 I'll start short selling anything that's on the market. Anyway, but in 1857, when factories were kicking workers out in the North, And the previously pretty arrogant Northerners who were saying, well, look at our civilization that is improving and growing. Look at the backward South by comparison. Weren't looking so good. And that comes through. If you read these documents like George Fitzhugh's praise of slavery, that is the backdrop. That's, he's saying, you know, you're going through this crisis. We're doing just fine. And why is that? Because you have freedom and we don't. And freedom is worse than unfreedom. Now, how does capital fix the crisis? There are different ways of doing that. The nature of the crisis is there's underconsumption. People don't buy things. They don't have the purchasing power. So if you want to keep selling things, you need to find ways of investing your money that is actually generating a return on investment. You can do that by two ways mostly. You can intensify production, so you can make the same stuff just more cheaply and effectively. And or you can expand your geographical reach, meaning you open up markets where you haven't been selling stuff before, or you invent markets for things that hadn't been for sale before. So in the South, of course, you have an untapped market that is huge. None of the slaves are buying commodities. And you don't even get industrial manufacturing there because the whole workforce is unfree. You can't hire them to do work for you. If only you could get rid of slavery, the South would be the natural fix for this economic crisis. Suddenly, all the capital that the North has available and more could be productively used to modernize the South. And this is one of the main reasons why, starting in 1857, Northern businessmen who had been just fine with slavery as long as it wasn't getting in the way of their business, suddenly discovered that slavery is a scandal and that it needs to go, and now begin to finance the Republican Party with money and other resources, and in some cases even running for office under the label of that party. And of course, the slaveholders, as we've seen with Fitzhugh, also get more aggressive in the defense of their institution. They're seeing that in the North, people are stepping up the attack on slavery, and they become more vicious in their defense of it. And they're also realizing that in the North, they have a potential ally, the enemy of their enemy. If the Northern industrial elite is going after the slaveholders, the workers whom they have fired, whom they're underpaying, may well be a potential reliable ally for that Southern elite. So that is it for this lecture.